For 15 years I was the perfect Morgan daughter-in-law. I cooked, cleaned, and cared for Brandon's entire family while running their household. On my deathbed at 35, watching them celebrate my husband's engagement to his mistress in the next room, I realized I'd wasted my life. Then fate gave me a second chance. Reborn 20 years in the past, I had one goal. Instead of being the family's unpaid housewife, I'd build an empire that would make them work for me. I gasped awake, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. Instead of the hospital bed where I'd been dying at age 35, I found myself in my old teenage bedroom. The pink walls, the boy band posters, the small desk where I used to study, everything was exactly as it had been 20 years ago. I rushed to the mirror and nearly cried when I saw my young face looking back at me. I was 15 again, and this time, I wouldn't waste my life being the Morgan family's perfect daughter-in-law. In my past life, I'd married Brandon Morgan at 20. He was handsome, rich, and charming, every girl's dream. But that dream turned into a nightmare. I gave up college to run his family's household, cooking and cleaning for his parents who lived with us. They treated me like a servant, criticizing everything from my cooking to how I folded their laundry. Brandon never stood up for me, too busy with his family's restaurant business and his secret girlfriend. I died young from exhaustion and stress, watching through my hospital room window as they celebrated Brandon's engagement to his mistress. But now I had a second chance. When Brandon first noticed me at school that day, I didn't blush and stammer like before. Instead, I walked right past him, focused on getting to my business class. I remembered how his family's restaurants would fail in 2011 because they didn't adapt to changing food trends. While Brandon tried to get my attention with expensive gifts and love notes, I studied hard and planned my future. His mother, Patricia Morgan, came to visit my parents one evening. She talked about what a good match Brandon and I would be, how the Morgans could give me a comfortable life. My parents seemed impressed. We weren't rich, and the Morgans owned the biggest restaurant chain in town. But this time I spoke up. "I'm focusing on my education," I said firmly. "I plan to go to business school." Patricia's perfect smile cracked slightly. "Dear, why waste time and money on college when you could marry into our family? Brandon will inherit the business, and you'll want to be home taking care of the family anyway." Her words made my blood boil, but I kept my voice calm and steady. "Mrs. Morgan, I appreciate your offer, but my future isn't for sale," I replied. My parents looked shocked. In my past life, I'd been too shy to stand up to the Morgans. But watching their surprised faces now gave me strength. I have my own dreams to follow. Over the next few months, Brandon didn't give up easily. He'd wait by my locker, send me flowers, and tell everyone I was playing hard to get. But I stayed focused on my goals. During lunch breaks, while he tried to catch my eye from the popular kids' table, I sat in the library researching successful restaurant chains and future food trends. I remembered which cuisines would become popular, which business models would work, and which mistakes to avoid. My parents worried I was making a mistake rejecting Brandon. "The Morgans are a good family," my mom would say. "They could give you security." But I knew better. In my past life, that security meant being trapped in their mansion, serving their every whim while my own dreams died slowly. I took a part-time job at a local cafe, learning about food service from the ground up. Every dollar I earned went into my savings account. Brandon would drive by in his expensive car, probably wondering why I chose to work when I could have an easy life with him. He didn't understand that this time around I wanted to build something of my own. When college acceptance letters started arriving, Brandon made one last attempt. He caught me after school looking handsome in his designer clothes. "Sarah, why are you doing this?" he asked. "We could be perfect together. I could give you everything." I looked at him, remembering how in my past life he'd stood outside my hospital room planning his new life with his mistress while I lay dying. "No, Brandon," I said quietly. "You can't give me what I really want: respect, independence, and the chance to build my own dreams." The day I left for business school, I drove past the Morgan family's flagship restaurant. Patricia was at the window, probably wondering how I'd slipped through their fingers. They didn't know it yet, but in a few years they'd all be working for me. This time around I wouldn't be anyone's servant, I'd be the boss. As my old town disappeared in the rearview mirror, I smiled. 20 years of future knowledge and a second chance at life were powerful tools. The Morgans thought they'd lost a potential housewife, but they'd actually lost their future savior. When their businesses started failing, I'd be ready. But first I had an empire to build. 5 years flew by like a dream. I graduated from business school at the top of my class, armed with both my future knowledge and proper education. While my classmates celebrated with fancy parties, I was already setting up my first restaurant. I found a small place downtown, nothing fancy, but the location was perfect. In my past life, this area had become the city's hottest food district by 2010. The day I opened Sarah's Kitchen, I noticed Brandon's new wife, Jessica, walking past. She looked exactly like I used to, tired trying to please everyone. He'd married her 2 years ago and now she was living my old life, running the Morgan household while they criticized her every move. Sometimes I wanted to warn her about what was coming, but I had my own path to follow now. My restaurant was different from anything in town. I mixed comfort food with modern twists, using recipes that wouldn't become popular for another decade. People loved my fusion tacos and innovative salads. I worked smart this time, no wasting time hand-washing dishes like the Morgans made me do before. I invested in good equipment and treated my staff well, remembering how miserable it felt to be unappreciated. Word spread fast. Food bloggers couldn't stop writing about my unique menu. While the Morgans stuck to their outdated fancy dining concept, I gave people what they would want in the future: healthy, exciting food at reasonable prices. My social media strategy worked perfectly. I remembered how Facebook and food blogs would shape the restaurant industry. Brandon started showing up for lunch regularly. He'd sit at the counter watching me run my business with the confidence I'd never had in my past life. "You've changed so much, Sarah," he said one day. "I hardly recognize you." I just smiled, remembering how he used to mock my business ideas when I was his wife. Now his family's restaurants were starting to struggle, just as I knew they would. The recession hit just as I remembered it would. While other restaurants panicked, I was prepared. I kept my prices reasonable and my quality high. The Morgan restaurants, with their overpriced menus and poor management, started losing customers. I watched as they closed their first location, then their second. Brandon looked more stressed each time he visited my restaurant. My investors were impressed by my growth. "How do you always know what people want?" they'd ask. If only they knew. I opened my second location near one of the Morgan's failing restaurants. The irony wasn't lost on me when their regular customers started coming to my place instead. Jessica came to my restaurant one afternoon looking exhausted. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Run a successful business and make it look so easy?" I thought about telling her the truth, that I'd lived this life before and knew all the pitfalls. Instead, I just said, "By believing in myself and not letting others control my life." The bank approved my loan for 2 more locations. This time, I didn't need to beg Brandon for money like I had in my past life. My own credit and success spoke for themselves. I hired good managers, remembering how I'd wished for help when I was drowning in housework at the Morgans. By the end of that year, my restaurants were thriving while the Morgans' empire crumbled. Brandon's father, Richard Morgan, started asking around about selling their remaining locations. I kept quiet, building my war chest, waiting for the perfect moment to buy them out. Every night, I'd look at my successful business and think about my past life, how they'd laughed when I suggested modernizing their restaurants. The best part was watching Patricia Morgan's face when she read the newspaper article about my success. "Local woman revolutionizes city's restaurant scene," the headline read. The same woman she'd once thought only good enough to be her son's housewife was now becoming her biggest competitor. Brandon tried to rekindle our old connection, dropping hints about business partnerships. But I remembered lying in that hospital bed, listening to him plan his future with someone else. No amount of his charm could erase that memory. I kept our interactions strictly professional, focusing instead on my expansion plans. As I reviewed the blueprints for my next 3 locations, I couldn't help but smile. The Morgans had no idea what was coming. In my past life, I'd been their perfect daughter-in-law, sacrificing everything for their approval. This time they'd learn what it meant to work for someone else. Karma was about to serve them the biggest dish of humble pie they'd ever tasted. 3 years later, my restaurant chain Sarah's Kitchen had become the talk of the city. I owned 7 thriving locations, each one more successful than the last. Meanwhile, the Morgan family's restaurants were falling apart exactly as I remembered. Their outdated menus and poor treatment of staff finally caught up with them. One rainy Tuesday morning, Richard Morgan walked into my office. The proud man who once ordered me around his house now looked tired and desperate. "Sarah," he said, trying to sound confident, "I have a business proposition for you." I gestured for him to sit, remembering how he never let me sit in his presence in my past life. He spread papers across my desk, documents showing the Morgan restaurants were drowning in debt. We need a buyer, he admitted. Someone who understands the restaurant business. Brandon suggested you might be interested. I kept my face neutral, but inside I was smiling. In my past life, I'd watched them lose everything while I was stuck being their housemaid. Now I had the power to buy their entire chain. I knew their secrets, the hidden debts, the health code violations they'd covered up, the taxes they'd fudged. But I also knew which locations had potential. I'll need to look at your books, I said calmly. Richard's face fell. He knew their books wouldn't stand up to serious inspection. That's when Brandon burst into my office. Sarah, please, he begged. You have to help us. My marriage is falling apart. Our business is failing. You're our only hope. I looked at him, remembering how he'd ignored my business suggestions in my past life, telling me to focus on housework instead. You don't recognize me, do you? I asked quietly. They both looked confused. I'm the same girl you tried to turn into your family's servant years ago. The one you said wasn't smart enough for college. The one you wanted to keep locked in your kitchen forever. Their faces went pale as understanding dawned. I bought their restaurants for half what they were worth. The Morgan family name, once the pride of the city's restaurant scene, now belonged to me. I kept their good staff, giving them better wages and benefits. But I fired the managers who'd treated workers badly, just as they'd once treated me. Patricia Morgan came to my office next, tears in her eyes. How could you do this to us? She demanded. After all we offered you? I looked at the woman who'd once criticized my every move as her daughter-in-law. I'm not doing anything to you, I replied. I'm just running a business, something you never thought I could do. The local business magazine ran a story about my takeover of the Morgan restaurant chain. They called it a masterclass in modern business strategy. Nobody knew the real story, how I'd lived through their downfall before, how I'd learned from watching their mistakes in my past life. Brandon's marriage finally collapsed under the strain. Jessica left him just as I should have done in my past life. He started drinking, showing up at my restaurants late at night. We could still work together, he'd slur. Like old times. But there were no old times. I'd changed that future. I renamed their flagship restaurant Sarah's Kitchen Premium, transforming their stuffy dining room into a modern space. On opening night, I saw the entire Morgan family watching from across the street. They looked lost, seeing their family legacy transformed. But business was business, something they taught me themselves. The best part was changing their old mansion, my prison in my past life, into my company's training center. New chefs and managers learned there, in the same kitchen where I'd once been treated like a servant. Every morning, walking into that building as the owner instead of the housewife, I felt stronger. Richard Morgan finally swallowed his pride and asked for a job. His restaurant experience was good, despite everything. I made him a manager at one of my smaller locations, not out of revenge but because everyone deserves a chance to work for their living. That's something I learned the hard way in both lives. Looking at my empire at the end of that year, I felt no joy in their downfall. Instead, I felt pride in my success. In my past life, they'd buried my dreams under a mountain of housework and obligations. This time I'd built something lasting, not just for me but for everyone who worked for me. That was the best revenge of all. Life has a funny way of coming full circle. Brandon Morgan, the man who once had everything, now stood in my office asking for a job. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple button-down shirt. His famous family name couldn't save him anymore. He needed work and my restaurants were hiring. I can start you in the kitchen, I said, watching his face. In my past life, he'd laughed when I suggested I could run a restaurant. Now he nodded eagerly at the chance to work in one. The pay is fair and there's room to grow if you work hard. He accepted without argument, how different from the proud man who once ordered me around. Patricia Morgan came next. The woman who used to criticize my hostess skills now wanted to be a hostess herself. I have nowhere else to go, she admitted. Looking at her designer bag, probably her last one, I remembered how she used to mock my simple clothes when I was her daughter-in-law. You'll need to wear our uniform, I told her. And you'll have to be kind to everyone, staff and customers alike. The first time I saw Richard Morgan in his server's apron, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who once sat at the head of his family table demanding perfect service, now carried plates to other people's tables. He was actually good at it, Turns out he'd learned something from all those years running restaurants. Jessica, Brandon's ex-wife, came to thank me. "You saved me," she said. "When I saw you succeed on your own, it gave me courage to leave." She'd gone back to school just like I'd wanted to in my past life. I gave her a part-time job to help with her expenses. After all, I knew exactly what she'd been through. My restaurants became famous for more than just good food. Business magazines wrote about how well I treated my employees. The secret to Sarah's Kitchen's success: happy workers, one headline read. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Morgans had built their business on exploiting people and lost it the same way. Brandon surprised everyone by becoming a good worker. He started in dishwashing, moved to food prep, then cooking. Without his family's money to fall back on, he finally learned the value of hard work. Sometimes I'd see him teaching new staff members with real patience, something he never showed me in our past life. Patricia struggled at first. Being kind to customers didn't come naturally to her. But after a few months, she changed. Regular customers started requesting her section, saying how warm and friendly she was. "I never knew how hard this work was," she told me one day. "I wish I'd understood this years ago." The local news did a feature story about my business. They interviewed my employees, including the Morgans, about what made Sarah's Kitchen special. Richard Morgan, now one of my best servers, looked straight into the camera and said, "Sarah taught us that treating people right is good business. I wish we'd learned that lesson sooner." During our busy Christmas season, I watched them all work together. Brandon cooking, Patricia greeting customers, Richard serving tables. They weren't the same people who'd made my life miserable in the past. Hard work had changed them just like it had changed me. One evening, Brandon stayed late to help clean up, something he'd never done in his privileged past. "I get it now," he said quietly. "What you tried to tell me years ago about respecting everyone's work. I was too stupid to listen." I just nodded. The lesson had cost him everything, but at least he'd finally learned it. My executive team suggested promoting Brandon to kitchen manager. He'd earned it. Patricia won Employee of the Month twice. Richard's tables had the highest customer satisfaction ratings. They weren't succeeding because of their name anymore, but because of their actual work. Looking at them now, tired after a long shift but satisfied with their honest day's work, I felt no more bitterness. In my past life, they'd treated me like their servant. But in this life, they'd learned to serve others with dignity. Sometimes the best revenge isn't making others suffer, but watching them learn to be better people. That Christmas, during our staff dinner, I watched the Morgan family sit with other employees, laughing and sharing stories. They weren't above anyone anymore. They were just part of the team. In the end, that was worth more than all the revenge I'd planned in my past life. 10 years after my rebirth, Sarah's Kitchen had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. 25 restaurants across the country, a cooking school, and a line of premium sauces sold in supermarkets. The same banks that once rejected my loans now begged to finance my expansion plans. I started a program called Future Chefs, helping young people from poor backgrounds learn the restaurant business. Many of them reminded me of myself in my past life, full of dreams but lacking opportunities. Brandon, now my head of kitchen training, worked especially well with these students. His own fall from privilege had taught him valuable lessons about humility. Patricia Morgan had become our customer service trainer. Who would have thought the woman who once made me cry over imperfect table settings would become known for teaching others about kindness? Success isn't about being above others, she'd tell new employees. It's about lifting everyone up together. Every time I heard her say that, I smiled, remembering how different she used to be. Richard Morgan managed our flagship location, turning it into our most profitable restaurant. He'd learned to value his employees, remembering his own time as a server. The man who once demanded perfection from others now helped his staff grow and improve. His team had the lowest turnover rate in the company. One morning, an investor offered to buy my company for $50 million. As I sat in my office considering the offer, Brandon knocked on my door. He didn't try to win me back anymore. Those days were long gone. Instead, he came to share ideas about expanding our training program. "We could help so many more people," he said, his eyes bright with genuine enthusiasm. I declined the offer. Some things were worth more than money. The company wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd helped build it, including the changed Morgan family. They'd earned their places through hard work, not birthright. Jessica, Brandon's ex-wife, opened her own small bakery after finishing business school. I helped her with startup advice, and now her shop supplied desserts to all my restaurants. We often laughed about how different things turned out from her days as the Morgan family's daughter-in-law. The business magazines called me a restaurant industry revolutionary for my employee-first approach. They didn't know that I'd learned these lessons the hard way, through 2 lifetimes of experience. When they asked my secret to success, I always said the same thing. Treat everyone with respect and success follows naturally. I met David, a kind restaurant supplier, at a food industry conference. He loved my business philosophy and didn't care about my growing bank account. After a year of dating, he proposed. Our wedding was simple. No fancy mansion reception like my first marriage to Brandon. Just good food, good friends, and genuine happiness. The day I received the Restaurateur of the Year award, the entire Morgan family sat in the audience, not as my former in-laws but as valued employees. Brandon led the standing ovation. Patricia wiped away tears. Richard nodded proudly. They weren't the people who'd once trapped me in a life of servitude. They'd become something better. In my acceptance speech, I didn't mention my past life or my rebirth. Instead, I talked about second chances, how everyone deserves the opportunity to learn, grow, and become better. Looking at the Morgans in the audience, I saw them nod in understanding. Last week, I turned 35, the age I died in my past life. But instead of lying in a hospital bed, forgotten and used, I stood on the roof of my flagship restaurant, surrounded by people who respected me. Brandon approached with a business proposal for another training center. Patricia shared ideas for improving our customer service program. Richard reported record profits from his location. Looking at them now, hardworking, humble, and genuinely changed, I realized something important. True success isn't just about making money or getting revenge. It's about creating something meaningful that helps everyone grow. In my past life, I died alone and bitter. In this life, I built a legacy of positive change. Sometimes at night, I still think about that dying woman I used to be, trapped in the Morgan family's mansion. I wish I could tell her that everything would work out better than she could imagine. Not because of revenge or punishment, but because sometimes the best revenge is living well and helping others learn to do the same.